It's such a difficult thing to get all the technology straight because I'm doing different things. This is my setup for YouTube, but I messed up. I had it set up for Facebook, and never mind. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that we face the world as it is and deal with it appropriately as we always should. And, you know, one of the things that's difficult is to accept that you can never get it exactly right. And yet, we are in a position where we need to do everything that we can to do so. For example, right now, you can see this reflection of these box lights in my camera. I didn't get it right. These are reading glasses. They're no good. These are my broadcasting glasses. You see, there's no reflection there. The secret to that is I actually poked the lens out of that. That's a secret for you if you're ever doing some video recording. You got a problem with that. Problem is, of course, if you need the glasses to see like I do, you're kind of wrecked. But that's just the way it is. Okay, so today we're going to deal with one of the fundamental lessons. In fact, many of the great saints of the past have said the primary characteristic of someone who follows Jesus, who is disciple, is humility. Learning humility is always a challenge for us because there's something in our sinful nature that rises up that says me first. It's exhibited by a bunch of children sitting around a table saying, your piece of cake's bigger than my piece of cake. Always comparing to others, always clamoring to be on top. Often the younger child thinks that the older child is dealt with with preferential treatment because obviously as an older child, they're able to take on more responsibility. And the younger child says, that's not fair. I want to be like my big sibling. And then the big sibling says, yeah, but that younger sibling gets treated with preferential treatment. They're spoiled. I was the youngest of five. And I had some siblings who really thought that I was spoiled. And I didn't think so. I don't know whether I was or I wasn't. What I do know is that humility is always a challenge. And so we're going to quickly run through some of the things that Jesus said when he used this illustration of being like a child. Now, there are not all the characteristics of childhood that apply, and Jesus doesn't tell us exactly which childhood characteristics apply. But we're going to go through when he says, you've got to become like the little child, or you won't enter the kingdom of heaven. So learning to be humble is a key issue for all of us in life. And remembering, first of all, that that's our responsibility is a key. Anyway, what's going on here? After Jesus has said, I'm going to Jerusalem, I'm going to face death, the followers had a different mindset. They were saying, oh, wow, the kingdom is coming, and I got to get my place in line for the kingdom. And the contrast was just stark between the problem that they uncover here with their children arguing about who should be first. And Jesus used it as a teaching moment. Now, there are some times in the life of Jesus where the teaching is indirect. Remember, we're dealing here with the training of the 12. You recall that. That's the book we're working on. And this is the chapter we're working on where the clip is. And sometimes the training that we've had in the previous 19 lessons was indirect. We have to take it by inference. But in this case, it's quite direct. And Jesus is saying, you guys just don't get it. And back on the Mount of Transfiguration in the previous lessons, they were told, listen to him, but they didn't. And the root cause was the sinful nature of their pride and their jealousy and their fighting against each other and so on. And this is, many believe, and I certainly agree with this is Jesus' most important training. And I think that when we look at people who fail in ministry or people who quit, they often haven't learned this lesson. You see, when you're young, you often start off with, I'm going to be great someday. And I'm going to whatever, if you're a pastor, I'm going to pastor a church of 1,000. I remember having those impulses, and they wouldn't go away when I was young. And I had to say to myself, no, you can't decide where the Lord will place you and how you will serve. And if you serve him well, you will see great results one way or another. But that is, there will be great results, but you may not see them. They may be a generation or two down or in a different church after you've left. And as I look back over all the churches in which I served directly as a staff member or a pastor, I can say cumulatively there is no question that God has given me more than 1,000 people. So, what a stupid, arrogant thing that was to say. But when I look at the cumulative effect of that, I've seen what God has done, and he's done amazing things after I left. And that's the best measure of my ministry in my mind, is after I'm gone, whether the seeds that I sought to plant actually not only sprouted, but continued to grow and flourish, even in different circumstances. It might not have been worse circumstances, but different circumstances when I was there. So this whole business of serving the Lord with humility is such a key. You've got to learn to be like the seed that grows where it's planted. You got to grow where you're planted and bloom there to the best of your ability. Quit wishing for more space in your life. Quit looking for somebody to recognize that you're really much better than you think that they think you are. Get over yourself. It is up to the Lord to use you, and so often the people who've gotten to prominent places, not always by any means, but they get to prominent places and they've demonstrated that they haven't learned the lesson of humility, and they get caught up with themselves and they get arrogant and they think there are special rules, and because of their position, and then those special rules, and everybody else is going, whoa, so-and-so is the great guru, and you can think of some as we go along here who will fall on you, wonder whatever happened. They seemed like they were humble because they learned to put on the outside, they wear the clothing of apparent humility. And then we found out later that no, they had a secret life that was dominating them, and they hadn't managed their own personality and their own situation. So we got to deal with this issue. Why is this training that Jesus is getting here in humility difficult? And why was it absolutely necessary? Well, first of all, there's probably nothing harder than training people to follow any universal principle, including yourself. And you're removing the whole business of pride, ambition, jealousy, and envy is tough for all of us. You have these things that creep up in your soul, particularly when you're tired, when you're worn out, when you think you're at the edge of burnout, and you have this, it's not fair thing rise up inside your soul, and you can't let it dominate you. You've got to learn what it is to excel in the things that demonstrate faithfulness, because that's what's required in a steward, his faithfulness. And you've got to overcome that selfishness. And every time you hear it raising its ugly head, you've got to, as Paul said in one of his letters, was it Titus? He said, you've got to learn to say no. And you got to stop those thoughts from dominating your thinking. When they come in, you've got to dismiss them. Just like all kinds of greed or lust or anger or other thoughts, you're going to say, no, that's not who I am. And even though it is a piece of who you are, because you still have a sin nature, you've got to dwell on the things that matter. Now, the difficulty with the disciples in this circumstance was they were looking for the results. Boy, isn't it going to be great when we get to the kingdom? And people have a way of dwelling on the results that are coming someday, and not dwell on the process. I keep reminding myself that I've got to learn to love the challenge of the process, not just the results that it will get. And just today, the challenge of the process for me was to make all this software work, and I have this feeling I can't keep up. And I know that the day is coming when I won't be able to keep up. But so far, I'm not doing that bad, am I? I don't think I am. I've just got to give it the best that I've got for as long as I've got until the Lord takes away my capacities, either physically or mentally, or just takes me home. Um, and these disciples writing about their position, it was really necessary that we get after it. So Jesus' teaching method was to say, you got to be like the child. Now he took the child in his arms, and he left. He got to Capernaum, and they went in the house. This is an interesting thing. A whole bunch of them in the house. And there's a child in the house. So I don't think this is a VRBO situation where you get to have the whole thing yourself and do your whole thing. I think there's a host there, so it's more like a massive Airbnb. I don't know, but there's a host around because there's a child there, and there's children with the disciples. Anyway, you get the idea. Jesus took the child, and he was using that child as an illustration of being the greatest in the kingdom. So you got to become like a child. No show off attitude. No idea of scrambling for, uh, we all should be treated equally. It's not fair. You're never going to be treated equally in life. You got to focus on the similarities with the child and the natural humility that the child understands that they need to be cared for, they need to be protected, and they need to be loved, and they need to be taught. Hey, children know that. They come with an attitude when they're at their best that says, please teach me, please help me, please keep me from the struggles of the world around me and from the friend who's rejected me and so on. And those sensitive moments with your children, so important to their long-term development, to listen to them, to care for them, to have them explain their perspective on things, and to help them gain an adult perspective, but much more importantly, a godly perspective. What a blessing it is to have children to train up in the way that they should go, and they will make a decision later on in life. And I had a pastor remind me once that it's when they're old that they won't be part from it. They might have a falling away time where they're reevaluating, but be like a child, be humble, and recognize that you don't have it all together. So, of course, Jesus was the most perfect example of humility. The Pharisees were always giving him a hard time. He rejected that, and it's a whole business of how he had to deal with the struggles of people who were giving him undue adulation where they weren't ready to really follow him. And at the same time, people who were trying to put him down. He lived out that perfect life of humility. And in the training of the 12, he was demonstrating it as he went. Um, so if we think about the characteristics of those who are spiritually great, these are Bruce's points. Some of the things I've said before, but these are Bruce's points. Um, it's always childhood humility is always a mark of spiritual growth. Um, self-forgetful service. Not saying when do I get my turn. There's no time for self-promotion. I listen to some guys on podcasts, and they make me squirm a little bit because they say, "Well, we did this and we did that, and the Lord did this through me." It's kind of like, yeah, you really think you did it, and the Lord's lucky that He's got you on the team. Yeah, I guess I'm being a little judgmental there, but sometimes you can pick up the vibes from people that they're not really content with God's plan in their life. There's a verse in the Psalms that says, the boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. Always remember that God has placed you in pleasant places, even when you might be living in a war zone. Some tranquility that you have become a pleasant place for you. Now, the characteristics of those who are spiritually small, well, they always act on their own self-importance, and they are always scheming, and they're always trying to become the chairman of the board or the committee, and they think reputation in front of others, and they're trying to glorify God while also glorifying themselves. And this is a key issue. They're saying, I'm doing it for the glory of God, but I like a little glory for myself. I've had many friends over my lifetime that I just had this nagging feeling that while on the surface They believed they were there serving the Lord, and I don't doubt that they were in some ways. There was a little bit of, yeah, it really buoys me up to have people responding to me. It's like, I don't know, I've heard this from my brother-in-law, or I don't know, I think his, I've got a good sermon on humility, but I'm not going to preach it to a crowd less than 1,000. The idea that I'm too big for this. And I've dealt with people who said, yeah, Jesus said where two or three are gathered, and the other guy's saying, oh, he's only going to be two or three. Wait a minute. If you have an attitude of humility, those the two or three that God gave you for that moment, and that you took the initiative to get into the place at the moment, then they're the people you've got to give your best to at that time. And I don't know right now whether anybody's going to be watching it. I don't know whether anybody's watching it live, and I don't know whether anybody will be watching it in the future, but I'm going to give the best I've got for today. It may not be the best that I could do overall, but it's the best I've got for you today. And I hope that comes through to you. See, Jesus taught us to live by a different set of rules. He didn't say that there wasn't a ranking. He said the person who does this will be great, and the person will be least in the kingdom. So there is a ranking system. It's not an equality. It's all equal in the sense that we all get the main piece of the reward. But there will, in fact, be places. And Jesus says he wants to be first to be last. He said that's quoted for us several times in the Gospels. And, it's an entirely different system. We don't know what the ranking system is. We don't know how it all works. I've said to people, it would be awfully nice if when I get home with Jesus, who made him face to face because I love him so much, that he could say to me, well done, good and faithful servant. I'm not sure I get that far, but I'm kind of hoping for a pretty good, Gary, pretty good. Because I know it's very imperfect along the way. I'm giving you the best I've got for this day. So, obviously, when Jesus says you got to be like these little ones, he's speaking metaphorically. Um, receive people graciously, whether they're rich or poor, whether they're famous or infamous, whether they're depressed or at the top of their game. Don't hurt people with harsh and heartless, contemptuous behavior. I know I've been guilty of that on occasion, and I regret it that I haven't mastered myself, sometimes pushing people off because they were the little ones. Uh, you know, everything, cup of cold water done in his name receives a reward. Now, he also gives this tremendous warning who don't get it right. And if somebody offends one of these little ones, and we're not just thinking children, but we're including children, then it would be better that a millstone were hung around their neck. And I see millstones on occasion. Perhaps you have. These things are massive. You can't swim with a millstone around your neck. And Jesus is saying this heavy weight will sink you if, in fact, you are proud. And it's a severe symbolic warning about the millstone. Um, uh, you know, it's a terrible thing that you get into that situation. Paul says, he had a perception that he himself could conceivably become a castaway. I don't really know all the characteristics of castaways. That's way above my pay grade. I don't understand it. The people that used to follow Jesus and they don't anymore. I don't know. I can't figure out who's a castaway and who's not. All I know is that I'm responsible for me. So you got to be wise. You got to deal with the situation where you fear appropriately what God wants you to fear, where you constantly examine yourself. I'm amazed at how quick I am to examine other people and recognize where they fail, and not so quick to recognize or to justify my own failures. The first or second Corinthians, I think it is, 13:5. I'm guessing at that. You'll have to look it up. It says, examine yourself, whether you be in the faith. Um, every time you offend somebody else, it's a mark against you. So work very, very hard at not being that offense to people. That's the key thing for us as we move forward in our life. Now, I'm hoping that this has been an encouragement to you. Perhaps the Spirit of God is working on you if you're watching this. If you've gone away, come on back, rewind. I know you're multitasking. That's what we do on the internet. That's so much better when it's live. But I want you to consider yourself and think of where you are. A famous philosopher long before Christ, I can't remember if it was Socrates, Plato, I said the unexamined life is worth living. I believe that's true because the Bible says it's true. Examine yourself. Today is a good day for you to examine yourself. And I want to conclude by saying, I hope that this lesson has been useful for you. I hope that the other lessons that have gone before have been useful for you. I really, really want you to pass this on to other people who could benefit from it. I'm amazed at some things that I did over a decade ago that are out there on the internet. And I keep getting people giving comments about how useful they are. I haven't even gone back to look at the stuff to know whether it's as good as they think it was. But, I get 4.6 star ratings out of 5 on some things. See, there I go bragging about myself. But the point I'm trying to make is you'll never know if you do what you do at the best level that you can today as to how God will reward you directly in earthly times, but certainly when we get to be home with him, he will evaluate how well we're doing. And there will be a ranking system it's very opaque to us. We do not know how he will sort things out. But the last will be first and the first will be last. So you be in the category that where you give up the notion of being first today so that maybe you can get closer to the front of the line in eternity, which will in itself demonstrate the beauty of following Jesus. Well, I hope we see you next week. And please bring a friend along. Get somebody that you sit down with them and watch this thing together and nod your head with them and say, isn't that a good point? And say, I don't agree with them on that. It doesn't matter to me. Interact. Get this conversation going because all of us need a greater dose of humility. See you next time.